Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, Steve Scalise was in town this week and had something to say about Donald Trump. The congressman has also been in the news with speculation about ambitions that he and other members of the Louisiana delegation may be having. We'll look at both. There were two transit issues in the news, one possibly coming, the other stalled. RTA's decision to expand bus service from the city to Oxnard Hospital has some Jefferson Parish officials wrinkled. Meanwhile, it was announced that the new Algiers ferry landing has been delayed. We'll ask why. As we move toward the end of August, we will look at how this tropical season has compared so far with the notorious season of 2005. And the winds are blowing to upgrade the Jefferson Parish Carnival celebration. On the route for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. Jessica Williams, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And Mark Schlefstein, environmental reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. Going over to Jessica first, and you went to the Rotary meeting where Congressman Steve Scalise spoke, and he had some things to say about our president.
He did. He defended him. He defended his style. One of the questions that was asked, how do you explain his style? In the room, I should start by saying the room was very cordial. He was in New Orleans. He covers a part of New Orleans, but also mostly the suburban parishes. But those in the room asked thoughtful questions, and he really used the opportunity there to talk about the parts of the president that we don't get to see. Steve said that the president behind closed doors is all business. He will work with Steve in order to get votes on controversial issues. The Republicans right now are split on the issue of immigration and just what reforms to the law should look like, child migration, chain migration, looking at different ways in which they can appease all sides. And he said the president has been really instrumental in the past on bills where Republicans have been split, calling them down to the White House, inviting them to go over the bill's main points, answering any questions they may have. He also mentioned that after he got out of the hospital, his surgery, the president reached out to him, checked on him, asked him how he was doing. And that's really the side of him that he says he sees. All the stuff on Twitter, he says he's not so familiar with Twitter, he's not so familiar with some of those more controversial statements that the president has made there. But he assured the room that the president is indeed a different person behind closed doors, or presents himself differently behind closed doors.
Well, millions of people are certainly familiar with those tweets on Twitter, from the president. Overall, it sounds like it has been certainly. The congressman has been really supportive of the president.
He has. He's, came out early on as one of his biggest supporters, particularly just going back to the issue of immigration. The president and Steve Scalise have advocated for a merit-based system as opposed to the lottery system that's in place right now. And at the meeting, he equated it to an issue of, criminals versus college graduates. Right now, we have a system that makes it difficult, he said, to deport a person who commits a felony when they've served their time back to their country. But at the same time, we have a system that allows folks to come here, be educated in our colleges, but then are deported back when they're through. And we can't get them to stay because of our rules. So why not have those folks stay on and then we make it easier to deport criminals? He's also talked about, and he framed it in a very common sense way that sort of oversimplifies an issue that's been very controversial.
And much more controversial than that.
Much more controversial than that, much more complicated, and even folks within his own party are split on it. And that was just one of the ways in which he talked about these very controversial statements by the president in a way that made you feel as though they were much less complicated than they were.
How does Congressman look? I mean, he went through a real serious traumatic event, and people are really sort of astonished at how well he's rebounded. Did he seem really strong to you?
He did. He came out, he had a big smile on his face. He was giving everyone handshakes, smiling at folks, answering questions even after the event was over. Certainly didn't show any signs of fatigue. He does carry a cane now as he continues to recover. But, for the most part, when we spoke to him, he didn't seem as though he was missing a beat. He's certainly back to work at Capitol Hill, gave a commencement address at LSU earlier this year. And this talk is expected to be one of many he'll make as he gears up for fall elections this November.
He was able to make that play at second base to the congressional baseball game, so I guess that was a good sign.
Yeah, he's certainly been talking about that. He joked at the Rotary the other day that he's got a big blow-up picture of him playing against Cedric Richmond. He's talked about his relationship with the other leading Democrat, or the only leading Democrat in Louisiana in Congress. He talked about how they've been able to work together across the aisle, even on issues where they don't always agree. And he talks about that picture in his office when he invites folks up from New Orleans. He says, "This is when I stole home on Cedric."
It actually, I have to say, I've been in his office. He showed it to me. It actually
He showed it to you?
Of course. And that's the story he tells. It actually was a wild pitch. He didn't really steal home with Cedric. You know, Cedric's the star pitcher for the Democrats, of course. So it's a little embellished.
So,
but we'll give it to him.
so the congressman says, you know, he gets to spend some time with the president. I mean, how often does he get to see the president? And, you know, will the president just take his phone call if he calls?
He didn't go into detail on the amount of time that they're there, but you've got to assume with him being the third-ranking Republican in the House and him being responsible essentially for getting together votes on major party issues, that he is conversating with the president a lot. And he certainly talked about those conversations when they're down to the wire on something and when they need, you know, 13 Republican votes because all the Democrats are against it, and he's having to, you know, get in the same room with the president or get the team on board with what the president wants to do on those occasions and on many others. So it's safe to assume, I think they talk a lot.
Okay, and his position might even rise a little bit. So let's talk about what might be happening with our congressional delegation and political futures.
Sure. Well, again, as Jessica mentioned, he's now the number 3 person in the House on the Republican side. That will not last for several reasons. One is we don't know which party will control Congress, but even if the Republicans do, Paul Ryan, of course, is leaving. So who's going to be Speaker? Yeah. That's the question. So the number 2, Kevin McCarthy from California, would like to be Speaker. Steve Scalise is kind of nominally supporting him, but there's a lot of jockeying going on. The feeling is that he might not be acceptable to some of the real conservatives in the House, and Scalise could be the guy who kind of gets that vote. And this is all going to play out behind the scenes. There's not going to be a public vote. The votes will be counted, and if, you know, what we would expect would be if McCarthy doesn't have the votes, he will not run. A third person is interested in that, and that's somebody even more on the conservative side, Jim Jordan, who is the head of the Freedom Caucus, which is the real conservative wing, who's also having some issues with, he's the guy who was, remember, a coach at Ohio State, and there were allegations of sexual abuse, that not by him, but that he knew about it and didn't do anything. So that's out there too. One thing that I thought was really interesting that Scalise did to kind of position himself recently is, remember there was talk that Jim Jordan, the Freedom Caucus guy, actually was pushing a measure to have the House impeach Rod Rosenstein, who is the Justice Department official who's in charge of the Mueller investigation. And this is something that is really seen as kind of having Donald Trump's back, as you were saying. And it didn't get support. It never came to a vote. But, you know, people like Paul Ryan spoke out against it. Other Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, people saying, you know, impeachment, you don't mess with impeachment. That's criminality. That's, you know, I wrote a column, Tom Porteous, remember him, the former judge? He was the last person impeached for bribery and, like, really salacious stuff, not a dispute between the executive and administrative branches. But Steve Scalise endorsed it, and he kind of, you know, got a lot of criticism from more mainstream people for it. But that, I think you could see that as a play to kind of solidify himself on the right, looking at this race. Of course, you know, it could not be to fill Paul Ryan's shoes, it could be to fill Nancy Pelosi's shoes if they're in the minority.
So the political landscape sort of changes for Congressman Scalise. So what about governor?
Well, you know, he has said he will not run for governor, and he has said
it again at Rotary.
Really? Okay. And he said it very definitively. He's not with wiggle room. I'm not doing it as of now. So he could still do it, but I think he's sending a pretty strong signal that he won't. You know, which leaves the governor's race jockeying to John Kennedy and Jeff Landry and people like that.
So let's talk about the other members of the congressional delegation, like John Kennedy. You think he's going to be making a bid for it?
Boy, he is going after John Bel Edwards with everything he has these days, to the point where he did something that was really strange and unusual. So criminal justice reform is one of the areas where he's been very critical of the governor. You know, that's something that is really a bipartisan issue, has had a lot of Republican support in the state and has a lot of Republican support nationally, including in the White House. Donald Trump, there was a meeting at the White House that Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards was called to recently. He was the only Democrat in the room. It was other Republican governors and attorneys general. And John Kennedy sent a letter to Trump that day, basically saying, "Hey, it's not working. This isn't a model. This is a cautionary tale." So really trying to undermine the governor with the president, which is, not normally done. Normally, when you're kind of, looking at the White House, you stand down. But John Kennedy doesn't really stand down, does he?
And then Cedric Richmond.
Okay, Steve Scalise's friend across the aisle, he is completing a term as the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is a very public position. He's been particularly prominent because there have been so many issues that have come out of the White House involving race, so he's been speaking out on those. Again, what happens with the Democrats if they're in the majority? Does Nancy Pelosi become Speaker? There is some talk that maybe we should go to the next generation of leadership, and that maybe, kind of African Americans are the most loyal Democrats, that, you should see maybe more of them in the leadership spots. Cedric Richmond has really said he wouldn't mind seeing his friend Jim Clyburn, who is, again, a very senior African American, older Republican, a generation older. But there's some talk, his name is starting to get mentioned, which is interesting.
I know you wanted to touch on quickly, too, passing of Charlie Lancaster.
Yes, Charlie Lancaster passed on, unfortunately. He was the very long time state representative from Metairie. I have to say, one of the first people I met in politics, and he taught me well. I mean, we had fun conversations. Republican. One of the first Republicans, I believe the first Republican elected to the legislature, and he's one of the people, they call it the phone booth days, if you remember what a phone booth is. Back in the day that there were so few Republicans that they could meet in a phone booth. Right. People like Dave Treen, Brian Wagner, I should say, the former New Orleans city councilman who also passed on recently. And he's someone that really gets credited with helping grow the Republican Party that certainly has become dominant. And, condolences to his family. He was, he's one of these guys that everybody liked. Across the aisle, I have to say, same with Brian Wagner. I'd like to throw in a third. Ken Carter, the former assessor from New Orleans, Democrat. We're kind of losing a generation of people who you just wanted to just sit down and talk politics with all the time.
You're right. You could really learn a lot from all of those guys.
And he was the first of a group of young Republicans that started coming up at the same time.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that they were very excited to be there, and they were fun guys, too. So.
They were, and they just enjoyed it. And I have to say, the Louisiana Political Hall of Fame honored Charlie Lancaster this year, so it was nice that he lived to enjoy that, because he really did look like he enjoyed it.
All right, thanks a lot, Stephanie. Over to Mark right now, and mid-August, and the hurricane season is still here with us. I'm not going to say any more about the present because I don't want to, exit in any kind of way. However, let us compare it to the past. 2005 was really a very active season.
You can say that again. It was the most active season in modern history. 31 depressions, 28 named storms, compared to an average of 10. 15 hurricanes, the average is 6. 7 major hurricanes, 3 Category 3 or above, and 4 Category 5 hurricanes.
Wow.
And that's a storm with maximum winds of 155 miles an hour. We had 4,000 people killed that year from hurricanes, and that includes the 1,800 people who were killed in Louisiana. And there was $181 billion worth of damage from all those hurricanes in 2005 dollars. When you bring it back up to today's dollars, Katrina still ends up being the most expensive storm in history because of the key issues that were involved. One was the obvious direct effect of the storm, which was on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and the other was on the effects of the storm on a levee system that was improperly built, and which caused the significant damage here in Louisiana. So you look at what that storm was, and one of the other crazy things about that storm was that we actually had 6 named storms that were named with Greek letters of the alphabet, because we used up all the regular names. Let's hope that never happens. Right. And the last storm of the year did not end until January 6th of 2006.
Wow.
So It's a season we hope we
will ever
won't
repeat,
see again.
right?
If you think we had Katrina and Rita was, what, a few weeks later?
Rita was 4 weeks later.
Okay, but between that time, there were storms
K
from
through R.
L, M, N, O, P, and Q.
Exactly.
And I was wondering, where did those storms go? Okay.
Well, they all went off in other directions,
yeah.
thank heavens. But so you look at what caused that,
Right.
and you had a couple of key things according to NOAA scientists. The first was what they call a multi-decadal tropical pattern. There's just this thing that's out there, or it was out there up until the beginning of this present batch of storms. It's like somebody threw a switch in 1995, and all of a sudden we went from 1 or 2 storms a year to 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and then booming up. We're still in that era, but that era is supposed to last 25 to 40 years. So we're near the end of that era, hopefully, if we don't count into that the effects of climate change. So that's a big question that's still out there. The other key thing is that we had upper level winds that suppressed the creation of storms in the Atlantic. It's something that happens often. That would normally have, I'm sorry, I got that completely wrong. We had the upper level winds that were in the Pacific that were related to La Nina conditions, okay, which means warmer, cooler temperatures in the Pacific Ocean on the eastern part next to California and South America. That also ends up increasing the number of storms in the Atlantic. And then you had upper and lower level wind conditions in the Atlantic that were just perfect for creating hurricanes.
So let me get you back to the season right now. And the original predictions were revised downward in terms of the frequency of storms.
Exactly. So we've seen a couple of things that have been going on. And if you look back at 2005 and compare it to today, the first one is that we are in what's called El Nino neutral conditions. Water, heat, temperatures in the Pacific are pretty much near normal. So that means that you've got less chance of storms forming in the Atlantic, but not dramatically less. The other thing is that we've seen this huge high pressure system, what everybody calls the Bermuda High, that has just gone on and on and on.
That's
forever.
keeping us so hot.
And it's keeping us hot, and we're actually on the edges of it, so every once in a while we'll get some storms coming in from the Gulf, but not hurricanes. But it also results in fewer storms. And then we also have dry air. It's so dry that we've seen dust from the Sahara come in all the way to our coastline.
Well, all I can say is we're mid-August. We still have weeks to go, but I'll take the heat any day over a storm.
Unfortunately, the thing to remember is that it only takes one.
It only takes one. That's right. I know. So always prepare. Thanks a lot, Mark. I'm going to go over to Jessica right now. A couple of transit stories. The Algiers ferry landing, you tear it down, build a new one, but that's postponed now.
The Canal Street ferry landing, yes.
Canal Street, yeah.
So Canal Street, this is a project that Mayor Mitch Landrieu really trumpeted under his administration as a way to open up the riverfront, to give residents and tourists continuous access all the way from Spanish Plaza to the edge of where the wharf swap is happening now. And it was something that, a lot of residents in Algiers were really upset about. They said that the designs that the administration originally proposed, while, sleek and new, didn't include basic amenities like a bridge to cross over the railroad tracks, like covered walkways to protect folks from getting in wet when they get on the ferry and it's raining. And so the administration said, well, we'll find the money for a bridge, everything will be great. And then all of a sudden now we're finding out that costs have gone up. They thought they could do the first tear down and the rebuild of the ferry terminal for $14 million. The lowest cost that they got back when bids came back in July, I believe, was $26 million, so almost double that.
Yeah.
And now they're really having to go back to the drawing board and figure out, okay, that design isn't going to work. What can we change? What can we tweak? How can we get this back down in budget and still make sure that we're giving residents what they've demanded, which is, access, amenities, a bridge. And it's complicated because they've already spent, $3.8 million on just designing the first thing. They've got to throw that design out and start anew and get another one. They're hoping to do it before 2020, so in the next couple of years, we're hoping to see a new design by next year, and with the hopes that the terminal, which was supposed to have started to become demolished next month, will actually be demolished in the middle of next year.
There are actually some opponents to the design also who are kind of relieved really to see more time and study is going to go into this.
Yes, I mean there have been people that have said from the beginning, why do we even need a new terminal? Why can't we just spruce up the one that we already have, get some new paint in there, actually have the elevators to work or the escalators to work, work in bathrooms? That's all we really need. And so folks that have said that from the beginning, you know, Councilmember Kristen Palmer, some folks in the Algiers area are really relieved to see this, you know, sort of stumble in the process because they hope that it'll lead to a different result.
Okay, one other quickly, let's touch on the Jefferson Parish transit issue where RTA said that they would extend the Claiborne line all the way to Oxnard Hospital, but Jefferson Parish transit leader particularly said, wait, I didn't know
this was coming.
Yeah.
So this is something that apparently RTA officials had been talking about for a long time, and when I talked with Sharon Leader, she said she knew that it was on the table in Jefferson Parish, Jefferson Transit. She knew that it was on the table, but she didn't know that it was a done deal. She didn't know that it was coming in 2019, and she certainly hasn't seen any data to justify that, you know, they need this or that riders want this. All she's heard is anecdotes, you know, Oshner being excited, riders saying that they're tired of having to transfer and paying an extra $150 to ride the jet bus from the RTA bus. So this line would take where it stops now, which the 16 South Claiborne stops at South Claiborne and Carrollton, and extend it all the way to Oshner, which, as you remember, is doing a $360 million expansion.
Yeah.
So Oshner has got up, you know, in public, and everyone's in public really excited about this on the Orleans side. But, you know, Jefferson Parish official calls me and says, I didn't know anything about it.
Right, and they already have the bus, obviously, because that's where people transfer from the RTA to the Jefferson Transit right there at Carrollton and Claiborne. So
it's
there
really
could be two lines running at the same time. Yeah, it needs to be worked out.
Yeah, and that's something that, you know, they've said that they want to do it in 2019. She's saying, let's pump the brakes on this. Of course, the RTA can budget to run whatever it wants, but it is going to create a bit of a confusion for her system and a financial hit for her system if that goes through.
But this has been a goal for so long to try to integrate the transit system.
Well, it has been.
Yeah, regional. You know, regional is the key word, and I know Sharon Leader is a planner, and she's got real depth in transportation planning. So she emphasizes regional is the focal point, but let's do a little bit more study.
Well, for the longest time, a big criticism was that there wasn't enough transportation from the city to Jefferson Parish.
Where the jobs are.
Yes. Right, and now here's someone trying to do something.
Yeah.
Well, it still needs more planning and study. So anyway, it wasn't going to go until 2019 anyway, so I guess they'll get back to the drawing board on that one. All right, thanks a lot, Jessica. Errol, over to you, back to Jefferson Parish and Carnival.
Speaking of Jefferson Parish, if people wanted to take the bus to the parades, they've had 12 options during the year. There's been a lot of criticism of the Jefferson Parish Mardi Gras coming from people in Jefferson Parish. This isn't like city guys doing all this, okay? This is people in Jefferson Parish, and they realize there's been a decline in the Mardi Gras, the quality of parades, just the quality of, well, the floats, and people aren't masking, and there are too many parades that have too few bands, and instead they have this amplified music, and they're just not very good. And look, there's been a lot of beautification on Veterans Highway, but visually, Veterans Highway is no St. Charles Avenue in terms of the ambiance of a Carnival parade. So to the credit of the Jefferson Parish government, they've really been trying to deal with this. They actually had a committee last year, these people out there, and they were evaluating the parades. And on things, they counted how many people were unmasked, and how many real bands that you had, and they rated 4 parades, which as being the best, which I'll tell you what they are: Athenia, Caesar, Excalibur, and Little Rascals. And there was one parade, which I won't say, but it had like 32 people who weren't wearing masks, you know, and they criticized them. And so it's good to have somebody calling attention to that. But anyway, the council members are just trying to get some kind of a task force together to come up with an idea. But you know what the part of the problem is? The real decline in the suburban parade started with the growth of the Super Cruise in New Orleans, especially a parade like Endymion, which is made up of a lot of people from Jefferson Parish, but Box. Just think of all the people who ride.
Well, Endymion, as a Jefferson Parish politician,
parade, the total number of riders in Endymion would probably staff 4 or 5 small parades, and it's more glamorous to ride, and so I think that's caused a little bit of the decline. I would argue do something, but don't try to make it a New Orleans style parade. There used to be parades on Metairie Road, and there was, those are kind of charming and they were within scale. Why not have smaller parades with small? And so I think at least they're trying to do something.
They're trying to get some public input to it. Yeah. Okay, E, thanks a lot. Real quick, we can touch on Charles Rice leaving Entergy.
Yes. The head of Entergy New Orleans, Charles Rice, is no longer, apparently. And this is fallout from this scandal involving fake protesters who were hired by Entergy, by a subcontractor for Entergy New Orleans. The officials said they didn't know that they were basically paid actors shown up to pretend to be supporters of the new power plant they want to build. But they did orchestrate a big PR campaign, and if you kind of look at the emails, there's a lot of, wink-winking. Plausible deniability, I guess I would say. So this is something that's really blown up. It even made, the John Oliver show on HBO last week is satire, and it's, the new council came in, they were really angry because, of course, the old council was voted to pass this, this plant, and they've been calling Entergy before them. They're in investigation. There are also other issues with Entergy that they have not, kind of done in the councils. You have not done enough to expand solar, large-scale solar, and have cut back on maintenance. And there have been power outages. And
they recently raised rates on Algiers customers,
although
at the same time
back?
increasing their profitability. But when the council called them out on it, they dialed it back and said we're going to withdraw it.
But they have another proposal coming,
yes,
right?
We'll find out about that one in September.
Okay.
So now who takes Charles Rice's position?
That would be Rod West, who was the predecessor to Charles Rice, now his boss, who's going to take on his position in addition to running the entire company. So all of the energy execs in Arkansas, Louisiana, they all report to him. Now he's going to take on the job that he had before, which is running energy.
And he came to the Council Utility Committee the other day and said, I'm here to win your trust back.
Yeah.
We'll see.
We'll see.
Harder than that, I think.
Okay.
Harder than saying it.
All right. It's time to look ahead. Errol.
Dini's, which is a landmark in Bucktown, and then also spread with great success into the French Quarter, will be taking another step this coming Tuesday, opening its store on Magazine Street. And so that should really add to the booth of the magazine. And as it describes it, they're located on the corner of the Irish Channel and Gordon District, which is somewhere in Magazine Street. So,
Thanks,
we'll find it.
Stephanie.
So follow the smell. Back to politics, back to congressional politics. A former member of Congress, Bob Livingston, remember him, now a lobbyist, has a memoir coming out next month. So that should be interesting.
All right.
He's seen some stuff.
He has indeed. Jessica.
As part of Energy's big apology, it is going to voluntarily put solar on 100 homes in the city and give customers a bill credit for using their electricity or using the solar and feeding it into the grid.
Okay, the lucky 100 then. Good. Mark.
The East Bank Levy Authority and St. Bernard Parish are now up to 5 lawsuits with the parish filing against them. The first one of those should go before the court by the end of the year over how much money the parish should pay for internal drainage in the parish and how much the levy authority should pay.
Okay, we'll be looking for that. Thanks a lot, you guys, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. And of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.